Hello, hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Joe slid from the saddle with dinner on his mind. He had spotted the speckled form of a grouse pecking its way through the trees at the edge of the trail. He didn't have any birdshot, but he didn't need it. One well-aimed rock would be enough. Leaving his pack horses behind, he plucked a sizable chunk of granite from the ground and stepped through the brush onto the overgrown, older trail. A moment later, his quarry came bobbing into view, strutting the length of a fallen tree. His first throw sent the stone soaring over the bird's head, and it landed with a thud beneath a pine tree. Joe felt a pang of embarrassment at missing such an easy shot. The grouse raised its head and emitted a few low clucks, but seemed otherwise unfazed. There was a reason they were called fool hens. His second attempt was better calculated, whizzing through the air, striking the bird's chest, and sending it crashing down into the grass. That was the easy part. Plucking and roasting the thing would take significantly more skill. Joe peeled a bark scale off a nearby pine and sauntered around the decaying root crown of another. He scanned the trees. The late September sun was already casting long shadows across the forest floor, and he could almost taste the dinner of fresh game and old bread that awaited him. His appetite was ruined when he cleared the fallen tree and saw that the bird had landed next to a shallow grave. It was more of a depression, really, obscured by a clump of bushes and just deep enough to keep a body out of sight of the old trail that lay 20 feet away. Inside lay a skeleton, dressed in what remained of a tattered black double-breasted vest, a grayish-brown overshirt, and a pair of blue serge pants with one of the pockets turned inside out. The skull lay 3 yards away, flesh still clinging to the part that lay against the earth. A bullet hole at the back revealed several gold teeth shining in the sunlight. Joe grabbed his prey and hurried back to his pack train. He tied the grouse to his saddle and clicked his tongue at his horse. Dinner would have to wait. There was a killer on the loose. You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. This is the final part of my 4-part series about ghost town ghosts, featuring tales of terror and dread with a side of history from one of our country's countless vanished communities. Tonight, another story from my own home province of British Columbia, and arguably the most famous ghost town in Western Canada. The story is about friendship, about a connection that can pierce the veil between this world and the next. It's also a tale of mystery, of true crime, and of how historic facts and figures can take the shape of legend. This is the story of the haunted Barber of Barkerville, BC. Part 1. Murder on the Trail. Most people who grow up in British Columbia know the name of Barkerville. a tiny historic town in the central interior of the province. Many will go there at least once in their lives, despite the fact that, for those in the Lower Mainland, who make up roughly 60% of the population, it's over an 8-hour drive away. Once the center point of the Caribou Gold Rush, Barkerville is now a National Historic Site of Canada and the largest living history museum in Western North America, with an impressive collection of restored heritage buildings, authentic displays, and, in the warmer months, enthusiastic interpreters who bring the town to life. Each year, over 65,000 people, some international, most from BC and Alberta, trek up the Caribou Highway to hear the stories, some more factual than others, about how life used to be. The last hour of the drive from Quesnel to Wells and Barkerville isn't particularly impressive, especially by BC standards. There are no Rocky Mountain vistas or crystal blue lakes. There's just a 2-lane highway cutting through endless pine forests and wetlands with the occasional historic site or landmark, the kind you find at the end of muddy pullouts marked by a tiny, faded sign. Blink and you'll miss them. One is especially easy to miss. On the north side of the highway, it's likely overlooked by most who travel to Barkerville. It's not a famous structure like the historic Cottonwood House, and it doesn't offer a view like Jack of Clubs Lake. It does, however, have a story. And at just 1.2 acres in size, it has the distinction of being British Columbia's smallest provincial historic site. Remote, isolated, set back in the trees and not visible from the road, sits a lonely grave of a man who was murdered over 150 years ago. But before I tell his story, I should provide a bit of context. The province of British Columbia was built on gold. Prior to 1858, the British Crown was generally happy to leave the mainland, what they called the Columbia District, and New Caledonia in the hands of the Hudson's Bay Company and the 200-plus First Nations who lived there. But the discovery of gold in the Fraser Canyon, in the traditional territory of the Stalo people, changed everything. News of the find attracted a lot of attention, both from the British government and from the hundreds of thousands of American miners who, still starry-eyed with dreams of instant wealth, were lamenting the recent end of the California gold rush and looking for a new opportunity to get rich. Fearing that a sudden stampede of Americans would signal the end of British sovereignty, James Douglas, governor of the colony of Vancouver's Island, stationed a gunboat at the mouth of the Fraser and started charging license fees for those who wanted to travel upstream. Nearly 30,000 people obliged. A few months later, on August 2, 1858, Douglas officially proclaimed that the territories between the Pacific and the Rockies were suddenly, quote, wild and unoccupied, end quote, and now belonged to the Queen as the colony of British Columbia. From there, the Royal Engineers blasted their way through canyons and built sprawling wagon roads. Various officials made a fortune off of subsidies and tolls, and steamboats carried tens of thousands of miners upriver. Many of those miners continued further north following the Fraser River in the hope that they would find an even richer deposit. They found it on Williams Creek, near the center of the province as we know it today, in a place now known as the Caribou Plateau, in the territory of the Takel and Shuswap people. The revelation would result in the Caribou Gold Rush in 1861, the most famous in BC history. The gold was so plentiful, in fact, that the government quickly sprang into action to build the Caribou Wagon Road, a monumental feat of engineering spearheaded by the Royal Engineers. The road aided the transport of over $6.5 million worth of gold and led to the establishment of multiple towns almost overnight, including most famously Barkerville, which, within just a few short years, was bustling with over 4,000 people, multiple saloons, general stores, hotels and boarding houses, a drugstore, a barber shop, a theater, a bank, and its very own brewery. Now, that might not seem like much in today's standards, but at its peak, Barkerville was the largest settlement north of San Francisco and west of Chicago. Along with their obvious impact on BC's history and economy, the Caribou Gold Rush and Wagon Road contributed to the colony's culture as well, attracting people from all backgrounds and helping to inspire poetry, the fine arts, folk music, and, of course, folk tales. Some are fantastical, and some, like tonight's story, are a blend of history and legend. This is a story about 3 people, one of whom, by the end, will lie in that lonely roadside grave I mentioned earlier. The first is Wellington Delaney Moses, Del for short. Business owner, barber, inventor of a dubious hair tonic, a British subject of African descent, and a familiar face in Barkerville. The second is Charles Morgan Blessing, about 30 years of age, a miner from the northeastern United States. The third is James Barry, about 29 years of age, a rambler and gambler from Texas. It was the spring of 1866, and all 3 were on their way to Barkerville to find their fortunes. Del had been working as the town's barber for a few years, spending the spring and summer in town and wintering in Victoria. He and Charlie first crossed paths in New Westminster and voyaged together on a riverboat heading west up the Fraser River to Yale. The 2 men took an instant liking to each other, despite the fact that Charlie seemed quiet, even timid, compared to the talkative barber, and they agreed to travel together. Del got to know Charlie as they traveled. He didn't talk much, but Del concluded that he was an honest, moral man who was a bit down on his luck. His clothes were well cut, but worn through, and he had the look of a man who'd been traveling for a while. Indeed he had. He was working the gold mines in Calaveras County, California, when he received a letter from a friend suggesting that he help work a claim in Van Winkle, one of the many communities on the way to Barkerville. With his California prospects tapped out, Charlie figured it was time once again to head north of the border. He literally had almost nothing to lose. At this point, we don't know for sure, Charlie may have shown Del one of his few prized possessions: 2 stick pins connected by a chain, and each crowned with a nugget of gold that he had personally dug from the earth. A certain quirk of one of the pins made it especially unique. Turned upside down, the nugget at the top resembled a man's face in profile. Several days and about 500 kilometers later, the 2 friends arrived at Quesnel Mouth, or simply the Mouth, on May 28th. Known today as Quesnel, it's still a key stopping point for those traveling north through the province, located roughly 700 kilometers northeast of Vancouver. They spent the night at Brown and Gillis's Occidental Hotel, a popular waypoint for travelers on their final leg to Barkerville. The next day was spent enjoying the well-earned comforts of the Occidental, and it was over drinks in the hotel saloon at approximately 7 p.m. when they met the third character in our story, James Barry. A stranger to both men, James surprised them when he slid up to their table and greeted Del Moses by name. He was stout and shabby, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a patchy, rough-shaven beard the color of sand. His clothing was threadbare and soiled. His brown eyes twinkled in the lantern light. In many ways, James Barry was the complete opposite of Charlie Blessing. Loud and boastful, shifty and unscrupulous. For much of the day, he had been trying, unsuccessfully, to borrow money from his fellow patrons. Now Del and Charlie were in his sights. Leaning across the bar, he asked the men when they were planning to leave for Barkerville. Charlie said that he was eager to get to work and hoped to leave tomorrow, but Del wasn't so sure. The barber wanted to wait a few days and track down an old acquaintance from Quesnelmouth who owed him some money. Charlie was visibly disheartened by the news. The way he saw it, every day spent on the road, he was losing money. He didn't want to wait around while Del found his friend, but he didn't want to leave alone either. Del told Charlie that he didn't need to worry about money. He wasn't rich, but he wouldn't let a friend go without. That's when James spoke up. As luck would have it, He planned to head for Barkerville the next morning. They could travel together, while Dell stayed behind to tie up loose ends and collect his debt. It was a reasonable suggestion, but something about James made both of the men nervous. When they had a moment to themselves, Charlie leaned over to Dell and confided in him that he felt uncomfortable at the prospect of traveling with this strange man. After several moments of hesitation, he decided that he would wait for Dell to finish his business and declined James's offer. James shrugged and walked away. When he was just out of earshot, Charlie turned to Dell and said something that likely remained with him for the rest of his life. "Remember my name," he said. "Charles Morgan Blessing. It's a singular name. If anything should happen to me, you will know who I was." His words would prove to be prophetic. Later that afternoon, after chatting privately with James Barry, Charlie suddenly had a change of heart. With James by his side, he called Dell up to the bar and informed his friend that he had decided to travel with James after all, evidently despite his misgivings. He promised that he would meet up with Dell in Van Winkle when the barber followed through a day later. He bought Dell a goodbye drink and paid with a $20 bill, no small sum back in those days. Dell's eyes widened. "Charlie, you're not broke yet," he said. "No," Charlie replied with a smile. "I have a few more of these left." The brazen flash of cash was one of his final mistakes. Charlie left with James early the next morning, and Dell never saw his friend alive ever again. When Dell arrived in Van Winkle 2 days later, Charlie was nowhere to be found. The barber continued on to Barkerville, but still there was no sign or word of his friend. He began to suspect that the uncomfortable feeling he got from Barry was genuine intuition. A few days later, Dell ran into James Barry at a Barkerville shop. This time, the down-and-out gambler looked a lot more prosperous, cleaned up, well-rested, and in a new outfit. Dell asked him flat out, quote, "What did you do with my chummy?" end quote. James acted dumb at first, but finally said that he had abandoned Charlie shortly after they left the mouth. Charlie had a sore foot and couldn't travel, he said, so he left him behind. He assumed that, if Charlie wasn't in Barkerville by now, he likely returned home to California. Dell was skeptical. It was true that Charlie had a few blisters that were slowing him down, but if he needed to rest, why didn't he simply return to Quinnellmouth and join Dell, or meet up with him a day later? The barber saw the gambler a few more times that week and never failed to ask about Charlie Blessing. The last time, James became viciously angry and snarled in response. "What do I care about the man? I'm no caretaker of his." Now, all of that could have been coincidental. In Barkerville, fortunes were won and lost in the blink of an eye. People came and went constantly, and many would-be miners were defeated by the Caribou Road before they even made it to the mines. But Dell's funny feeling about James Barry and his worry for his friend persisted. He feared the worst, but had no proof. By all appearances, Charles Morgan Blessing had simply disappeared. On Saturday, September 29th, 1866, almost 4 months to the day that Charlie went missing, the rowdy but respectable community of Barkerville was shaken by the news that the skeletal remains of a man had been discovered west of town, where the wagon road intersected an older trail, just beyond a place called Beaver Pass. Justice of the Peace William George Cox and Chief Constable Fitzgerald were dispatched to perform an inquest. The two quickly discovered that the man had been shot in the back of the head. On or near the body were a silver hunter case watch, a small clasp purse containing a few grains of gold, a silver pencil case, and a sheath knife engraved with the initials CMB, and a new drinking cup with a name scratched on the bottom, C.M. Blessing. On Monday, October 1st, these and other details were printed in the local paper, the Caribou Sentinel, which noted that they were being provided to help ascertain the exact identity of the man as, quote, No one appears to know him, end quote. That was about to change.
Hello, hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little
You
bit.
could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Part 2. The Spectre and the Sleuth. Everything you've heard up to now is, as far as we can tell, historic fact. Here's where the legend comes in. Actually, there's two of them. One is a ghost story. The other, a tale of amateur detective work. They're often told together, one bleeding into the other, and there's a good chance you'll hear one or both on a visit to Barkerville, especially if you visit the recreated barbershop of Del Moses, the hero of both stories. The story goes that Del never stopped wondering about the fate of his friend, and when he reopened his barbershop, he would ask every one of his customers if they had seen Charlie at the mines or in their travels. The answer was always no. After a few months of hearing the same thing, Del was ready to give up his search, until one customer came through his door. But it wasn't anything he said, it was what he was wearing. One of Charlie's gold stick pins, the one that looked like a man's face, gleamed in the light that fell across his lapel. After recovering from the shock, Del asked the man where he got it and if he'd be willing to part with it. The man told him that a dancing girl, known as a hurdy, had given it to him. And after a bit of negotiation, the man left the barbershop, freshly unburdened by a few inches of hair and one gold pin. Del closed early that day and went straight to the dance hall. He found the woman that his customer mentioned and, after showing her the pin and confirming the story, asked her how she came about owning such a unique piece of jewelry. It was a gift, she said, from a well-off gambler named James Barry, as a token of his unrequited affection. It was now clear that James had done more than abandoned Charlie Blessing by the roadside. But was he only guilty of theft, or something far worse? Del placed the pin inside a drawer for safekeeping, knowing that there just wasn't enough evidence to go to the authorities. When questioned, James could simply say that he had found the pin by the side of the road, or that Charlie had given it to him in trade. To accuse him of a crime, there had to be a victim, and Del was no closer to learning what, if anything, had happened to his friend. The final clue would come just a few days later when, according to legend, a very different kind of customer walked into his shop. It was a bright September afternoon. Del had finished sweeping the last of the hair clippings out the barbershop door and was straightening the bottles of his miracle hair tonic when he heard the groan of the door behind him and the sound of feet shuffling inside. He turned to welcome his next customer and was surprised to see his friend, Charlie Blessing, standing at the entrance. The man's clothes were wet and grimy, his face was gray with sunken, bloodshot eyes and a matted beard. He tottered across the floor, holding a hand behind his head and wincing in pain. "Charlie," Del exclaimed, his voice quivering. "I thought you were dead. Where have you been?" The grim-looking man didn't answer. He only motioned to his face and slowly crawled into the barber's chair. The heavy wood groaned under his weight. Del nodded in understanding. Nothing like a fresh cut and a clean shave to make one feel like a new man. Dell placed a clean, white towel beneath Charlie's head, who continued to stare at him with black, pitiful eyes. Turning his back to his friend, Dell took his straight razor from the table, clicked it open, and, with trembling hands, began to strop it back and forth against a long strip of leather. Charlie's haggard appearance demanded a sharp edge. Dell kept his razors in immaculate condition. A few passes were more than enough to give him a hair-splitting edge, but he kept dragging that blade back and forth, as a sense of creeping fear kept his feet glued to the floor. The fine hairs on the back of his neck brushed against his collar. Something in Blessing's eyes terrified him. Whatever it was that was sitting wordlessly in the chair behind him wasn't fully human. A bang as jarring and violent as a gunshot shattered his thoughts, and Dell wheeled around. The chair was empty, and the white towel was now red, soaked with blood. Dell realized that he had just received a message from beyond the grave, and its meaning was clear. The next day, word spread through town before the newspaper's ink was dry. The body of Charlie Blessing had been found in a secluded spot just off the road to Barkerville. He had been shot in the back of the head, and the murderer was unknown. Unknown, that is, to everyone but Dell. It's a matter of record that Dell immediately went to the authorities in neighboring Richfield to report what he knew. A week later, a warrant was issued for the arrest of James Barry. Constable John Sullivan began to investigate and soon learned that Barry had left town with considerable speed shortly after whispers began to circulate about a body on the trail. Barry had a few days' head start, but his trail was still warm. Sullivan rode hard throughout the night, pursuing Barry over 160 kilometers south to Soda Creek and shrinking his head start by a matter of days, but it wasn't enough. The locals told him that Barry had beaten him by 2 full days and that he had caught a stagecoach bound for Yale. Even if he wasn't exhausted, even if he had a fresh horse running at full gallop, it would be impossible to catch Barry before he reached the safety of the U.S. border. If it had been a year earlier, that would have been it. Barry would have won. But Sullivan realized that, thanks to a recent leap in technology, he could communicate with his fellow officers in Yale. Earlier that year, telegraph wires had been installed as far north as Quinnellmouth, and, thinking quickly, Constable Sullivan wired Yale with a description of Barry and the order for his arrest. Just 12 hours later, James Barry's coach was intercepted 20 kilometers north of Yale at the Alexandra Bridge. It was, as far as we know, the first time in British Columbia that a criminal had been caught with the help of the telegraph. Though Barry gave a false name when questioned, the officer at Yale saw through his subterfuge and made the arrest. Constable Sullivan arrived on October 8th and took James Barry into custody. On their journey back to Barkerville, Barry refused his right to silence to ask the constable if it was Dell Moses, the barber, who had laid the charge against him. Sullivan assured him that all of his questions would be answered upon their return to Richfield. Part 3. Ghosts, Gold Pins, and Guardian Angels. On Monday, July 1st, 1867, James Barry was brought before Honorable Justice Matthew Bailey Begbie for the murder of Charles Morgan Blessing. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him was substantial. The jury only took an hour to render a verdict, guilty as charged. James Barry was hanged on the morning of August 8, 1867, before a curious crowd of onlookers, and alongside another man convicted of murder. Their bodies swung at the end of their ropes for 30 minutes before they were examined and pronounced dead. The crime and trial of James Barry caused a bit of a sensation in the Caribou. Barkerville and its neighboring communities were a bit wild around the edges, but not without law. Sure, a man would catch a beating now and then, a claim would be jumped, people were often drunk and disorderly, but something as egregious as cold-blooded murder was virtually unheard of. Perhaps that is why, throughout the years, the story has become so steeped in folklore. And that brings us to the pins, the most iconic part of the story. They're so iconic, in fact, that Judge Begbie sketched one of them in the margins of his bench book. They were the most damning evidence in the trial, telling a story by connecting the murderer to the victim and proving his motive. Barry was smart enough to leave behind the silver watch and pen case because they were both marked with the victim's name. Yet he didn't realize, or perhaps just didn't care, that the pins he had stolen were as unique and identifiable as a fingerprint, allowing them to be tracked from Blessing to Barry, and from Barry to a dancer at one of the saloons. Legend tells us that Del Moses recognized one of Blessing's pins on the lapel of a customer and chose to investigate further, leading to a reputation that still exists today as a quick-thinking amateur detective, or as one author put it, the Barber sleuth of old Barkerville. But history tells us a different story. It's true that Del was a friend and a traveling companion of Charlie Blessing, and he was the first person to point the finger at James Barry when Blessing's body was found. But there's no evidence that suggests that Del had seen or was even aware of the infamous pins. I love the idea of an old-timey barber moonlighting as a detective in a gold rush boomtown, but according to records, it was Chief Constable Fitzgerald, rather than Del Moses, who was responsible for tracking the pins back to a herdie who claimed to have received them from Barry. Others at the trial had been called on to identify the pins and their original owner, but Del wasn't among them. His testimony was solely to establish the identity of the victim, place him in the company of the suspect shortly before his murder, and demonstrate the suspect's agitation when confronted later. He never said a word about the pins. Nor did he mention any ghostly visitations, though that's probably to be expected. That's not to say these things didn't happen. Maybe Fitzgerald had acted on information he received from Del Moses. Maybe Del had some sort of paranormal encounter or vision, and mentioned it to his friends years later. These stories had to come from somewhere, right? I looked, but I couldn't find any contemporary account that suggests Del Moses did any kind of detective work, or even had a run-in with the supernatural. They're really just two versions of the same story, one with ghosts and one without. And despite having apparently no basis in history, they've enjoyed an exceptionally long life in BC's folklore, and have appeared over the past century or so in a variety of history books, ghost story collections, YouTube videos, podcasts, and live tours. As far as I can tell, all of these stories likely got their start from one source, a book written in 1905 by David Williams Higgins, the editor and proprietor of the British Colonist newspaper and former Speaker of the British Columbia Legislature. Titled The Passing of a Race, the book is a collection of what Wikipedia calls, quote, fictionalized reminiscences, end quote, from the mid-1800s. All of the stories have some kind of fantastical element to them, but the author provides a caveat, writing, quote, the stories of the occult, which comprise several chapters, are left to the judgment of wiser heads than mine. The reminiscent stories are all founded upon actual occurrences, and in the years to come may be found of value to the student of early events in California and the British Pacific. I have aimed to write history, so far as it came under my own observation, in an entertaining manner. End quote. Unfortunately, what was considered entertainment in 1905 can often be racist, misleading, and overly verbose. The Passing of a Race, as the title might suggest, is no exception. Higgins' story about Moses, Blessing, and Barry is titled The Guardian Angel, and the author takes a number of liberties in the names of quote-unquote entertainment. For example, the title is a reference to Blessing's gold pin, which, in this story, bore an uncanny resemblance to an angel with its wings outspread, and which Blessing believed brought him good luck. Now, you can't begrudge Higgins for this minor poetic change that makes the story more memorable. The other changes, however, are a little harder to forgive. We know for a fact that Wellington Delaney Moses was born in the West Indies and was educated, articulate, and well-liked. In Higgins' story, he's known simply as Moses, and his character is a stereotype right out of a minstrel show. Illiterate, submissive, and hailing from the southern states where he was formerly enslaved, this character's dialogue is written with what's called I dialect and pronunciation spelling to emphasize his lack of education and low intelligence. Blessing and Barry, who we know much less about, are given similar though less insulting treatment, with Blessing portrayed as a well-off white gentleman, husband and father from Massachusetts, and Barry as a racist, two-timing quote-unquote Irishman. The story plays out in a familiar and expected way. Moses leaves, Blessing travels with and is murdered by Barry. Moses recognizes the gold pin guardian angel on a customer and is subsequently visited by Blessing's ghost. He goes to the police, Barry is hunted and arrested, and Moses' sole testimony, dramatically detailing his exceptional detective work and paranormal experience, is enough to convict Barry of murder. Much of Higgins' story is silly, offensive, and very much of its time. But there are positives too. It's based on a true and compelling story, and the appearance of Blessing's ghost to his old trail companion is dramatic and memorable, though we don't know how much of the tale was invented by the author. Higgins came to British Columbia from California in 1858 and was the editor of the British colonist newspaper at the time of the murder and trial, so he must have been well acquainted with the story. We don't know if he was the first to credit Moses with Fitzgerald's detective work or if Blessing's ghost was his invention. It's possible that those details were well established in Barkerville and beyond, and that he was simply one of the earliest, if not the first, to write them down. Either way, it's likely that future storytellers were inspired by Higgins' story, continuing his legacy of angel-shaped gold nuggets, restless, bleeding ghosts, and illiterate mystery-solving barbers. After Barkerville was made a heritage museum in 1958, a renewed focus on caribou history lent a little more justice and reality to Moses' character, though the sleuthing and, quite often, the specter remained. And that brings us to the most important, and yet the most overlooked character in our story: the victim. Part 4. Charles Morgan Blessing. His grave is an official historic site. Hundreds visit every year. Thousands more hear the story of his murder while touring the town of Barkerville. And yet we know very little about him. So little, in fact, that many have taken the liberty to provide him with a backstory. Most paint Blessing as a wealthy, white American gentleman, the scion of a wealthy Boston family, as the Times columnist put it in the early 1990s. The illustrations accompanying Higgins' story depicts him as a thin, bearded, light-skinned ghost. In his testimony, Moses had described Blessing as a, quote, very timid, quiet, moral man, end quote, which was translated by some to mean naive and inexperienced. That judgment seemed to be confirmed by the fact that he would do something as foolish as flash a roll of cash at a saloon. In most stories, Blessing became the quintessential dude in Western slang, a rich man from the big city who wants to play cowboy, and who suffers when he realizes that his privileged upbringing did not prepare him for the trials of the trail, or the harsh realities of frontier life. Who else would ignore their instincts and choose to travel against their better judgment with a man like James Barry? Wellington Delaney Moses serves as an appropriate foil to Charles Blessing in these stories. Blessing was essentially a newcomer, while Moses was experienced and established in the area. Higgins tells us, incorrectly, that he was formerly enslaved. Later newspaper articles declare that he was illiterate. Today, he is fondly and somewhat reductively referred to as, quote, the Black Barber of Barkerville, end quote, a title that reinforces his lower social and economical standing compared to a wealthy white man like Charles Blessing. It makes for a great, albeit unlikely story. The streetwise Black Barber of Barkerville not only befriends, but avenges the naive white scion of Boston. But there's a problem with that narrative. Blessing was not particularly wealthy or privileged. In fact, it's very likely he wasn't white, but black. Now, I thought a long time about whether I should bring this up or not, because I've done a decent amount of research, and I haven't found anyone who has talked about this, and I can't be certain. Most storytellers specifically mention Moses' skin color, but say nothing of Blessing's ethnicity. Even back in 1866, most people would have assumed that he was of European descent. Remember, when Charlie was found, all that was left was a skeleton, some tattered clothing, and a few trace amounts of discolored flesh. There were no forensics labs, no databases for identification, just a few personal belongings engraved with the name of the deceased. The newspapers, always ready to declare a person, quote, an Indian or a colored man, end quote, weren't able to include that detail because it would have been nearly impossible to tell. After the story broke, Del Moses would have provided a clear description of Charlie Blessing to the constables of Richfield to help them piece together his final days. But as far as I can tell, the only public suggestion that Blessing was anything other than Caucasian came at Barry's trial, when Moses testified that Barry had used an anti-black racial slur in reference to Charlie Blessing. The word, which I won't repeat here, was a minor detail in a larger body of evidence that proved that Barry was acquainted with Blessing and knew him by sight. So the direct quote that Del provided was easily overlooked and appeared in only a few of the newspaper reports. The majority of people got their news from word of mouth rather than the papers, so that small detail never became part of the traditional story. Of course, the color of Charlie's skin shouldn't matter, and to their credit, the judge and jury agreed. They hanged Barry all the same. But acknowledging the likelihood that Charlie was black adds a whole new dimension to the story and explains a few curiosities, like why Del and Charlie were so quick to become friends, likely due to their shared experiences, and why both were worried for Charlie's safety if he were to travel alone with Barry. It might also explain why Charlie's friends at Van Winkle failed to come forward when his body was first discovered. Many white miners enjoyed jumping the claims of Chinese and black people with little repercussion, so they'd likely want to avoid attracting any attention. Charlie's ethnicity might also explain why his remains weren't claimed by his supposedly rich family, or transported and buried in the local whites-only cemetery. Instead, he was buried alone, in the middle of nowhere. With these considerations, we start to get a more detailed picture of who Charles Morgan Blessing might have been, and you might begin to see why I called this episode The Haunted Barber of Barkerville. It's true that Del Moses was a barber and a purveyor of questionable tonics. It's also true that he was well respected in town, despite, and this is true, attacking one or two people with his razor in the thoroughfare. But that's not all. Del was a member of the Pioneer Committee, a group of black settlers that rallied together in response to the racism and violence they faced during the San Francisco Gold Rush. They were some of the first civil rights activists in the American West, and Del was one of 3 delegates from the Pioneer Committee who personally met with Governor James Douglas in the spring of 1858 to discuss potential settlement by a black community within the colonies of Vancouver's Island and British Columbia, which promised the right to vote, the right to protection under the law, and eventually the opportunity to become a British subject. Del was one of the first to accept the governor's offer and encouraged others to do the same. These details about Moses and Blessing are important and add a sense of humanity, meaning, and emotional impact that is otherwise missing in most of the podcasts, newspaper articles, and books that touch on the subject. When Del and Charlie first met and began traveling together in the spring of 1866, it wasn't as a friendly, mystery-solving barber and a naive heir of a wealthy American family, but most likely as 2 men of color with shared experiences and struggles. As a civil rights activist, advocate for black settlers, and an established member of the community, Del might have felt especially motivated to help Charlie, who had traveled north from California just like him, in search of a better life. At the trial, Dell recalled the moment that Charlie decided to venture forth without him. Quote, "He said to me the reason he was going on was that he had not much money left and did not want to get broke in that country. I told him I did not have much myself, but that I should not see him want." End quote. Regardless of what we think of the ghost story associated with this legend, it's easy to believe that Del Moses must have been haunted by the terrible fate of his friend. Charlie had asked the barber to remember his name, and Del did as he was asked. 10 days before Christmas of 1866, the Caribou Sentinel ran this notice at the bottom of page 3. Quote, "We are requested by Mr. Moses to state that the remains of Blessing, who was murdered at Beaver Pass last summer, have been decently interred. A headboard has been placed at the grave with a railing round it. The subscriptions raised for the purpose amounted to $94.50. The expenditure was $105, leaving a deficit of $10.50, which can be easily raised." End quote. Today, Charlie's grave is very much as it was 150 years ago. A weathered marker with a curved top sits solemnly inside a white picket fence with this simple epitaph: "In memory of C.M. Blessing, a native of Ohio, aged 30 years, was murdered near this spot May 31, 1866. The saplings, weeds, and ferns constantly threaten to overtake this lonely miner's final resting place." A few years ago, Canadian novelist Essie Adujan gave a great Massey lecture titled "Canada and the Art of Ghosts." In it, she explains how ghost stories act, quote, "as clarifying narratives to explain what has shaped us and what continues to make us who we are," end quote, and suggests that some stories, namely stories of people of color, have been forgotten, perhaps because they don't fit the narratives that many storytellers in the past wanted to share. I think we can see that here. It's a sad irony that a murdered man whose last request was to be remembered has had much of his identity forgotten or willfully erased. British Columbia folklore has reduced him to little more than a ghost and a body, a prop for a murder mystery where a black barber is the unlikely hero who solves the case. In stories like these, the victim is arguably more interesting when he's a man of wealth and power because he has farther to fall. And the idea that north of the border, a rich white man can befriend a simple black barber feeds into our national identity that Canada was kinder, gentler, and less racist than the United States. The story of Blessing's murder will continue to be told, and I get it. I get why Dell's role is compounded with the work of Constable Fitzgerald. It not only makes for a better story, but it also ensures that Dell is given credit for what he did. It was, after all, his concerns, his suspicions, and his courage that ensured that James Barry was brought to justice. But we need to be careful that our folklore remains free of influence from racist stories written over a century ago, and that we don't oversimplify or rob a person of their identity just because we can't be bothered to learn the facts or fully honor the victim. Those who came before us have asked to be remembered. We owe it to them to do our best. That's it for this episode, and for my series on Ghost Town Ghosts. I hope you enjoyed it. And don't worry, I'll be back next week with a new story to tell. Until then, thank you so much for listening, and for joining me in becoming part of a Canadian folk tradition. Now that you know the story, share it. And remember, if you ever head to Barkerville, consider stopping by Charlie's grave to pay your respects. His story is just one of countless others who followed the Gold Rush Trail to infinity. Fireside Canada is written and recorded by me, David Williams, with sound design by Matt Kesselman. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our business manager. Jordan Heath Rawlings is our executive producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving this podcast a positive review. If you want to help even further, you can provide story ideas and more through my website. Every little bit helps to keep the fire burning and the Library of Legends growing. Learn more at firesidecanada.ca.
Hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.